Welcome to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, The First 100 Days, Part 1, an online U.S. history tutorial for students in 11th grade. In 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States. He inherited a severe crisis, the worst in many ways, since the United States had been torn in two by the Civil War. For more than 3 years, America had suffered from an economic depression that had come to be known as the Great Depression. It was an economic perfect storm of falling prices, industrial decline, and staggeringly high unemployment. The Depression had begun after the Wall Street crash of October 1929, the most devastating in the nation's history. The American economy had suffered brief depressions before, as recently as 1921 in fact, but when they were over, the economy had always bounced back. The Great Depression was far different. Nationwide, about 1 out of 4 Americans willing and able to work was completely unemployed. In some large cities, it was far worse. Half of adults were out of work. More than 1 million Americans had lost their homes or their farms. They had been unable to pay their rents or mortgages. Some survived by moving in with family or friends. Others lived in the streets, in boxes or shacks. Thousands of banks had failed, that is to say, completely gone out of business. More than 1,450 banks closed in 1932 alone. When this happened, the bank's customers lost their money, all of it, in some cases their entire life savings. They would never get it back. In the early 1930s, what we today might call a social safety net for Americans did not yet exist. There was no welfare, food stamps, or Medicare. There was no Social Security or unemployment insurance. Americans devastated by the Depression had little to rely on except charity and each other. President Herbert Hoover had been in office since 1929. Fairly or not, Hoover had been blamed for the Depression, and he was a deeply unpopular figure by the time he ran for re-election in 1932. A new president, FDR as he was widely known, would lead the American people through and eventually out of the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt would run for president promising to help those who had little, but he himself came from a background of great privilege and wealth. He attended the nation's finest schools, including Harvard College. FDR was part of the same family as former President Theodore Roosevelt, but the two men were only distantly related, fifth cousins actually. And while Theodore Roosevelt had been a Republican, Franklin was a proud Democrat. He had been nominated for vice president in the 1920 election, but his promising political career was almost ended in 1921, when the future president was almost 40. FDR became infected with polio, which paralyzed him in both his legs. Roosevelt would never truly walk again. He could only stand with steel braces on his legs and could take only a few short steps, awkwardly, usually supported by another person. The experience naturally changed Roosevelt's life. Those who knew him well said that his disability actually gave him the common touch and an empathy with the problems of those less fortunate, which he had previously lacked. After years of recuperation and physical therapy, FDR re-entered politics with a new determination. In 1928, he was elected governor of New York. During the early Depression years, as governor of the nation's most populous state, Roosevelt had a chance to prove his leadership and to provide a contrast with President Herbert Hoover. FDR was an activist who believed government must intervene to help and protect citizens from hardship. As governor, he had created a temporary emergency relief administration that had disbursed as much as $20 million to New Yorkers. No state had ever provided its citizens with so much aid. This put him at odds with Hoover's Republican Party, which generally believed in laissez-faire economics. According to this philosophy, depressions were natural features of a capitalist economy. In order for some people to succeed, others would sometimes need to fail. The laws of supply and demand would cause the market to correct itself in due time, and until then, it would be wrong for the government to intervene, even to help people. To do so would be like rewarding the losers of the Depression. FDR strongly disagreed. He was a progressive who believed in using the power of government to shape society. He recognized that the current depression was no mere bump in the economy, and he refused to stand idle while Americans, many millions of them, were hungry and without hope. To these unfortunate citizens, he said, aid must be extended by government, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of social duty. Another Roosevelt quote from the 1932 presidential campaign sums up his philosophy. The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly, and try another. But above all, try something. In 1932, Governor Franklin Roosevelt won the Democratic Party's nomination. He would challenge Herbert Hoover for the presidency. The Democrats in the 1930s represented a diverse mix of voters: Southern conservatives, Northeastern liberals, Protestants, Catholics, urban immigrants, rural farmers, union members, and white supremacists. Despite their divisions, the Democrats saw a tremendous opportunity when they nominated Roosevelt in 1932. Since the Civil War some 70 years before, only 2 other Democrats had been elected president. But now, with a wildly unpopular Herbert Hoover in the White House, the Republican Party brand was seen as tarnished. If the Republicans could be successfully blamed for the Depression, and if the Democrats could be seen as saving Americans from it, the result might be a long-lasting transformation of American politics, or so the Democrats hoped. FDR did not disappoint those who had nominated him. He flew to Chicago at the end of the convention to accept the nomination in person, the first candidate ever to do so. In his acceptance speech, FDR promised to work for the forgotten man at the bottom of the pyramid. He promised liberal thought, planned action, and the greatest good to the greatest number of our citizens. The speech contained the phrase that would come to define Roosevelt's agenda as president: "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people." 4 months later, Franklin Roosevelt defeated Herbert Hoover in a landslide. 57% of voters chose him, and in the Electoral College, FDR won 42 of 48 states. Many of those states had consistently voted Republican for generations. The Democratic Party also won large majorities in both houses of Congress, giving Roosevelt and his party a decisive mandate or the authority to lead the United States in a very different direction. Between FDR's election in November 1932 and his inauguration in March 1933, the Great Depression somehow took a turn for the worse. Panic had struck the financial system, and more banks closed every day. Out of fear that their bank might be next, customers withdrew their deposits and hoarded cash and gold, which caused more banks to fail. Fully 80% of the nation's banks were closed when Herbert Hoover left office and FDR assumed it. Rumors flew in Washington, D.C. that the federal government itself might not have enough money to pay its employees. Army General Douglas MacArthur had troops at the ready in case the economic distress turned into mob violence. What would Roosevelt do when he took office? Walter Lippmann, the nation's best-known political commentator, warned that FDR may have to assume dictatorial powers, in other words, rule as a dictator, to manage the crisis. His fear was not as far-fetched as it may seem. Across the world, and especially in Europe, nations like Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union had responded to economic and political crises by empowering men like Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Joseph Stalin. In the United States, would democracy itself become a victim of the Great Depression, or would Franklin Roosevelt succeed in bringing out the best in American democracy to combat the Depression? On March 4, 1933, Americans across the nation huddled around their radios. About 90% of people owned one, to hear what the new president had to say. Almost immediately, they heard these famous words of reassurance.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days.
Roosevelt went on to diagnose the national disaster in stark terms.
Values have shrunk to fantastic levels, taxes have risen, our ability to pay has fallen, government of all kinds is faced by serious curtailment of income, the means of exchange are frozen in the currents of trade, the withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side, farmers find no market for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment.
But the new president then took a positive turn.
And yet our distress comes from no failure of substance. We are stricken by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered because they believed and were not afraid, we have still much to be thankful for. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our great natural resources.
FDR concluded with these hopeful words.
We do not distrust the future of essential democracy. The people of the United States have not failed. In their need, they have registered a mandate that they want direct, vigorous action. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. They have made me the present instrument of their wishes. In the spirit of the gift, I take it.
Day one of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency marked the beginning of the New Deal. The first few months of the administration and of the New Deal have come to be known as the 100 Days. By most counts, FDR and Congress enacted 15 major new laws during this time, a remarkable statistic. It was a whirlwind period of new programs, new initiatives, and as FDR had promised, bold experimentation. At the New Deal's center were a group of academics and policy experts who worked for the president and were often called his brain trust. These included Rexford Tugwell, an expert on agriculture, Adolph Burrell, an economist, Harry Hopkins, who would lead the president's federal relief program, and Frances Perkins, whose background in improving working conditions led FDR to appoint her Secretary of Labor. Perkins was the first woman to serve as a cabinet member in American history. FDR took office without a single coherent vision for ending the Depression, and he often received conflicting opinions and advice from his brain trust. They didn't always agree with him or with each other. In response, the president developed a knack for trying some elements of each different approach while avoiding embracing any one approach completely. This meant that the New Deal would be a mix of successes and failures, and it was often messy in its scope. Ultimately, the new president proved to be a pragmatist, someone who embraced whatever worked rather than an ideologue, someone who has a set of fixed ideas in mind and won't give up on them. In very broad terms, the New Dealers had three main objectives: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief meant giving Americans, especially the 25% who were unemployed, the short-term financial aid they needed to survive. Recovery meant restoring the health of businesses and farms so they could create jobs. And reform meant regulating the economy in long-term ways so that future depressions would not be so devastating. None of these objectives was ever fully met, but their combined effect and the obvious effort the new government was putting into achieving them would restore some measure of energy and hope to a nation that had seemed almost paralyzed by the Great Depression. Besides the president himself, the most important New Dealer of all may have been his First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. From moment one, the new administration's absolute top priority was to restore confidence in the nation's banking system. On March 4, 1933, the day FDR took the oath of office, American banking was on the verge of collapse. 2 days later, on Monday, March 6th, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday. This closed all banks in the United States for 1 week. Working around the clock, the New Dealers came up with the Emergency Banking Act, which was passed by Congress on Thursday, March 9th, only 5 days into Roosevelt's presidency. Already the new administration was acting with lightning speed. The act gave the Secretary of the Treasury the authority to determine which American banks were financially healthy enough to reopen and which were not. Money from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, an agency that had been established under Herbert Hoover, was used to replenish the funds of other banks so that they could reopen with the government's confidence. On March 12th, a Sunday, the president took to the radio airwaves to explain what would happen next. In the first of what would be called his fireside chats, FDR spoke directly to the American people in a way no president had done before. Roosevelt called the listeners "my friends." He thanked them for the patience and good temper they had shown during the bank holiday. Playing teacher, he explained how banking worked and why the recent wave of bank closures had occurred. Because an understandably panicked population had created
a rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand.
He explained that tomorrow, Monday, March 13th, banks would start to reopen in the nation's largest cities, followed in the coming days by banks in other cities across America. Roosevelt promised that the banks that would reopen
have already been found to be all right.
He cautioned against the hysterical demands of hoarders and encouraged people to put back into the banks their cash they had withdrawn.
I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress.
He asked listeners for their trust, their confidence, and their support, and he closed with the kind of optimistic language that would become his trademark.
You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
President Roosevelt's gamble worked. Once the banks began to reopen, Americans eventually returned more than half of their hoarded cash. Citizens responded with another sign of confidence. On Wednesday, March 15th, stock prices experienced their largest ever one-day percentage price increase. It was not even remotely the end of the Great Depression, but in their first week, FDR and the New Dealers had successfully stopped the bleeding. Having stabilized the banks, the New Dealers continued to pass legislation to reform the nation's financial sector throughout the 100 days. By June 1933, President Roosevelt had signed into law the Banking Act of 1933. Among other things, it established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or a FDIC. By providing deposit insurance, the government promised customers that the money they put in their bank was safe. If the bank failed, the FDIC would pay depositors their money back. The original insured amount was $2,500 per bank account. The FDIC still exists today, and over time, the insured amount has risen to $250,000 per account. Some of the Banking Act's other provisions are known as the Glass-Steagall Act, named after the two senators who sponsored it. Glass-Steagall separated commercial and investment banking so that a bank could not do both. Commercial banks are what most people think of when they think of banks. They make loans, accept deposits, and protect the assets their customers entrust them with. Commercial banks invest their deposits conservatively in order to not risk losing them. Investment banks operate in a different realm. They deal with the sale of stocks and bonds, make mergers and acquisitions, and provide financing for large-scale business projects. Investment banking is riskier, but also offers the possibility of higher rewards. Prior to Glass-Steagall, especially during the 1920s, many commercial banks acted like investment banks, essentially gambling their customers' money in higher-risk ventures. This led to many banks failing after the stock market crashed and the Depression began. The Glass-Steagall Act required strict separation of commercial and investment banking. A bank could do one or the other, but not both. This provided another level of security to customers still anxious about redepositing their money in commercial banks. After Glass-Steagall, they knew their banks would no longer be allowed to make risky investments with their cash. Another decisive action FDR took during the 100 days was to remove the United States from the gold standard. This meant that U.S. dollars were no longer backed by gold, and that holders of currency could no longer go to a bank and exchange their paper money for actual gold. Instead, FDR wanted gold returned to the banks in order to inflate the money supply and allow the printing of more cash. In fact, he signed an order requiring holders of gold to return it to the Federal Reserve in exchange for a set price. Abandoning the gold standard was somewhat controversial at the time, but it was an action many economists had recommended and many Americans had wanted for a long time. Roosevelt's action would give the Federal Reserve the flexibility to print more currency throughout the 1930s.